She tried to publicly humiliate the pregnant ex to assert her own dominance in the room. Savannah thought she was destroying a weak, compliant woman facing the consequences of her choices. But her smug confidence shattered when she realized the quiet girl's secret child was actually a deliberate decision. She had just insulted the woman protected by Colton Hale, a man whose presence shifted the balance of power. Watch how this calculated woman realizes the game is already lost. She tried to publicly humiliate the pregnant ex to assert her own dominance in the room. Savannah thought she was destroying a weak, compliant woman facing the consequences of her choices. But her smug confidence shattered when she realized the quiet girl's secret child was actually a deliberate decision. She had just insulted the woman protected by Colton Hale, a man whose presence shifted the balance of power. Watch how this calculated woman realizes the game is already lost. Let us pause right here on this opening frame. You and I need to absorb the devastating irony here. Watch Maddie as she pushes against those heavy, soundproof glass doors. The air inside this elite boutique is thick with the scent of expensive leather and wealth. It is supposed to be a sanctuary. But look closely at her hand, instinctively clamped tight over her ribs. Beneath the heavy wool of that oversized coat, she is 8 months pregnant, her skin slick with cold sweat. She pulled off the impossible by escaping a kingpin of the criminal underworld. Yet the tragedy of survival is that we often carry the ghosts of our past into our future. She ran from a monster, only to harbor his undeniable bloodline deep within her own body. She is a walking harbinger of ruin. Picture this space not as a charming store, but as a sterile incubator where the untouchable elite purchase velvet thrones for their heirs. Maddie spent the last 8 months living like a ghost, severing every thread to that terrifying theater of quiet violence. She genuinely convinced herself she could simply vanish. But life has a way of forcing our hands, demanding we step back into the light. A child needs a crib. A child needs a blanket. In the ruthless network, she barely survived. Merely buying a pastel pacifier paints a target on your back. It is a harsh truth of the human condition. You can run to the absolute edge of the earth, but you can never truly outrun the physical consequences growing quietly inside of your own flesh. Pay close attention to the way she moves through this space. It is a masterful performance, yet entirely tragic. She is fighting every violent urge to snap her head around and check the shadowed corners for assassins. In the savage hierarchy, she survived. Bleeding in open water guarantees you will be consumed, so she forces herself to stroll. She glides past the heavy velvet curtains as if she is just another bored wife of a billionaire. It breaks the heart to witness how profound trauma permanently rewires a person. The hardest lesson is that true peace is never found in pretending to be safe. Even the girl behind the counter offers a dead, sterilized look that refuses to ask questions. Maddie is utterly surrounded by the cold machinery of unchecked power. Stick with me here, because this is where the tension becomes a living entity. The golden rule of this institutional silence is simple. You never ask where the unborn child came from. You just accept the money and report back to the shadow rulers. Notice how the temperature in the room seems to plummet instantly. Maddie feels the shift in her bones before her eyes confirm it. It is that suffocating pressure warning you that a predator is watching. We learn quickly that fear is a compass, but panic is a prison. You have to marvel at her iron will. Instead of surrendering to terror, she forces her racing heart to slow down. She drifts toward a row of reinforced wooden cribs that resemble tiny, armored bunkers far more than places of innocent rest. Look closely at the frame and process what is truly at stake. In the taxonomy of the underworld, an heir is never just an innocent infant. That child is a geopolitical asset, a literal chess piece maneuvered by violent men. The camera lingering on her trembling hand is devastating. She knows this baby could tear the syndicate apart. That is exactly why she condemned herself to this isolation. If the architect of her past discovers she carries his unauthorized blood, he will not simply kill her. He will completely erase her autonomy and lock her away forever. The painful lesson here is that our deepest secrets always demand a heavy toll. You can see the unadulterated terror flash in her eyes before she violently forces it back behind a clinical, deadened mask. It is genuinely brutal to watch her hands operate pure instinct, subtly pulling the thick wool of her coat tighter across her rounded belly. It is an act of desperate, primal shielding. She walks through this high-stakes luxury environment entirely alone, and that isolation is deliberate. She calculated the brutal odds. She knows that in a world ruled by monsters, leaning on a trusted friend is the equivalent of signing a death warrant. We often forget that misplaced trust does not destroy your heart. In her world, it puts you in an unmarked grave. To protect a child tethered to such a horrifying lineage, a mother must look at every smiling stranger and envision a hired executioner. It is a desperately cold, fractured way to exist, walled off from the warmth of the world. For one painfully beautiful second, her iron defenses crumble. She presses her trembling palm against the hidden curve of her stomach, whispering, "I have got you," entirely inside her own head. Paranoia is simply the weather she lives in now. But then, the illusion of safety shatters. We need to analyze this exact cinematic beat together. It is not the violent crack of a gunshot or a scream. It is a low, vibrating chuckle drifting across the showroom floor, and it instantly turns the blood in Maddie's veins to ice. Her knuckles lock onto the edge of the crib. Life teaches us that the darkest monsters often arrive quietly. It is the horrifying, familiar cadence of the man who authored her suffering. The nightmare just walked through the front door. The most bitter tragedy here is that she does not even need to turn her head to confirm his presence. That chilling vocal signature is permanently burned into the darkest corridors of her mind. It is the inescapable hallmark of a trauma bond. Moving with the stiff, mechanical dread of a condemned prisoner approaching the gallows, she finally forces her chin up, and there he stands, Brandon. He consumes every ounce of oxygen in the room as if he holds the deed to the air itself. Draped in flawless black tailoring, he radiates a terrifyingly calm dominance. He never has to raise his voice or reveal a blade. He merely exists in the space, fully aware that no living soul could defy his will without meeting a violent end. True power never has to shout. It simply waits in the silence. But an apex predator never stalks his territory without a trophy on his arm. Enter Savannah. Do not reduce her to a mere romantic partner. She is a highly calculated, weaponized asset. She glides into the room with the cruel precision of a scalpel, engineered to diminish anyone standing in her shadow. She bleeds generational wealth and untouchable cruelty. The very second Maddie locks eyes with her, the invisible walls of the boutique violently cave in. The suffocating claustrophobia of her former captivity floods her mind with blinding panic. Surviving one storm only guarantees you will recognize the lightning of the next. Every instinct screams at Maddie right now. Drop the heavy coat. Run before his predatory gaze locks onto your exact coordinates. Fate always demands a tragic punchline. The universe rarely grants a bruised survivor a clean getaway. Savannah executes a lazy visual sweep of the showroom, her eyes functioning like predatory radar until they snag violently onto Maddie's frozen form. There is an absolute void of empathy in her gaze. Instead, her painted lips stretch into a slow, terrifyingly satisfied smirk. She just located the wounded antelope separated from the herd. Well, she purrs, her voice smooth as glass but laced with venom. This is unexpected. She barely whispers the words. Yet, the chilling sound slices through the heavy air. We must remember that when monsters of this caliber acknowledge you, it is never a simple greeting. They are establishing ownership and pulling the invisible chains tight. Stick with me on this frame. The performance here is absolutely devastating. Brandon registers the atmospheric shift. Initially, he appears utterly bored, indifferent to the luxury around him. But the exact second his dark eyes process Maddie's pale face, the foundation of his reality violently fractures. It is far more than shock. It is the horrifying realization of a tyrant discovering the one variable he failed to control. His gaze drags downward, magnetically pulled to the undeniable curve she desperately attempts to conceal. Control is a fragile illusion that always shatters when life intervenes. For the very first time, the untouched shelter architect is completely unmoored, and Maddie refuses to blink, staring directly into the abyss of her worst nightmare. Every fragile illusion of safety she spent 8 months building has turned to ash. Brandon takes a single, measured step forward. He does not scream or reach for a weapon. He moves with the lethal calibration of a demolition expert examining a fatal crack in a foundation. And then he speaks her name, Maddie. The word is profoundly quiet, yet it strikes her chest like a physical blow. It is a heavy iron leash violently yanked back into his fist. One of the harshest lessons of survival is that our demons are terribly patient. In the span of a breath, that sterile boutique dissolves into a brutal arena of psychological warfare. The terrible secret is permanently exposed to the light. The desperate war for her unborn child has officially begun. Let us pause right here, you and I. Look closely at Savannah. She refuses to rush or elevate her voice. In this toxic underworld, women learn quickly that panic earns an early grave, while calculated silence wins a blood-stained crown. She glides across that polished marble like a remorseless specter, making a terrifying spectacle of her coldness. It is deeply chilling, yet profoundly tragic. She examines Maddie without a fraction of human warmth, studying her like a jeweler, scrutinizing a flaw in a cheap stone. The great tragedy of blind ambition is that the entry fee is often your humanity for Thakini. Savannah buried her own soul just to become the sharpest monster in the room. When you trade your empathy for power, you never truly win the game. You merely become the wooden board they play upon. The most devastating blows in our lives rarely arrive with a deafening roar. They slip through the air as a fragile whisper. The camera pans across the suffocating room as Savannah leans in, dropping her tone to a silken, venomous pitch. She claims not to recognize Maddie, letting the silence stretch until it suffocates everyone listening. "You look different," she breathes, turning the phrase into a finely sharpened blade. In the dim corner, Brandon merely stares. His eyes are hollow voids, completely stripped of humanity. His meticulously crafted empire of adoration is crumbling because his chosen victim no longer plays her part. It is a quiet tragedy to witness. Clinging to a fabricated version of someone else only shatters your own soul when the truth finally steps into the light. Let us watch this unfold together, you and I, because this is a masterclass in psychological ruin. Brandon shifts his hollow gaze downward, locking onto the heavy coat Maddie desperately pulls around herself. The silence in the room turns so dense it practically bruises the skin. Savannah unleashes a perfectly dead smile, asking if Maddie is 8 months along. It is a public execution. They are weaponizing pure innocence, twisting an unborn child into a blade to bleed a woman dry in front of an audience. It breaks the heart to watch such malice, yet it reveals a brutal truth about human nature. Those who thrive in darkness will always try to turn your greatest blessing into a source of public shame just to keep you beneath them. Murmurs ripple through the boutique like thick smoke creeping under a locked door. Focus entirely on Maddie now. Her knuckles turn white as she grips her coat, but her expression remains perfectly frozen. This is not defiance. This is the tragic, paralyzed stillness of a survivor who learned to turn into stone just to endure. She says it is none of their concern, her tone stripped of any emotion. Savannah simply feeds on that resistance, sweeping her gaze over the gleaming chandeliers to remind Maddie that in their beautiful rotting world, freedom is a myth. The luxurious walls press inward like silent accomplices. It is a bitter reality we must all eventually face. Sometimes the most impossible prisons to escape are not constructed from iron bars, but from pure gold and the suffocating weight of social expectations. A sharp, ragged breath escapes Brandon, and the illusion of the calculating aristocrat vanishes entirely. What replaces it is a portrait of pure, obsessive rage. He glares down at her, his jaw tight, and accuses her of vanishing without a single word. The tragic irony hangs heavily in the air. He is twisting her desperate flight for survival into a deep, personal betrayal. He wants the guilt to crush her for refusing to remain his emotional punching bag. In the past, that dark manipulation would have worked flawlessly, bending her into quiet apologies just for wanting to breathe. It is devastating to realize how many souls fall into this exact trap. If someone makes you feel a profound guilt for walking away from their cruelty, they never truly loved you. They only ever loved the feeling of controlling you. The old tricks fail to draw blood. Maddie refuses to shatter. Savannah closes the distance, stepping so near that her heavy perfume wraps around Maddie like a chokehold. She drops her voice into a sweet whisper, murmuring that a hidden pregnancy is a dangerous game in their circles. The word strikes the floor like a heavy bell. You and I can feel the atmosphere shift as these elegant women transform into a circle of starving wolves. Savannah smiles, basking in the ruin she orchestrates. The harsh lesson is written plainly across this tragic scene. A corrupt system will always panic the moment it encounters something it cannot command. When you finally break free from a toxic world, your simple independence becomes their absolute greatest fear. In this fractured moment, that unborn child becomes a glaring beacon of rebellion. Brandon clenches his jaw tight. He shifts his weight, sealing off her exit, demanding in a terrifyingly soft voice to know who she moved on with. A whispered threat always cuts deeper than a scream. He attempts to drown her in raw panic beneath the heavy stares of the room. Yet, instead of shrinking into the quiet victim she once was, Maddie slowly lifts her chin. No tears fall, only a haunting clinical calm remains in her eyes. That is the fatal strike. A tormentor knows precisely how to battle your rage, but they will completely choke on your cold indifference. True peace is never found in screaming at your demons, but in finally realizing their toxic voices simply do not matter anymore. I did not move on, Maddie replies, without a single tremor. I moved away. Those words crash through the room with devastating force. They carry the unvarnished weight of the truth, which is poison for souls drowning in delusion. For a brief second, Savannah's perfectly sculpted expression fractures. Brandon's eyes widen as his empire of control crumbles into dust. It is pure, poetic justice. They cornered her, expecting to feast on her humiliation. But Maddie sees the sudden terror bleeding into their eyes. The life she carries destroys their fragile game. This moment reveals a beautiful truth. The cruelest figures in your life never operate from a place of true strength. Their malice is merely a pathetic shield designed to hide their own devastating insecurities. The silence is pulled so tight it hums, like a wire ready to snap. Brandon is visibly unspooling, his shoulders locking as he attempts to stare her down like a wounded predator. Sensing their dominance turning to ash, Savannah ruthlessly pivots to rewrite the narrative. We need to examine this closely, you and I. She adopts a gentle, mocking cadence, questioning if Maddie fled from responsibility rather than saving her life. It is a vicious tactic designed to convince the audience that Maddie is not a brave survivor, but a coward fleeing her duties. She is stealing Maddie's truth in broad daylight. The vital lesson here rings incredibly clear. You must never surrender the pen to someone else. If you allow another person to write your story, they will ensure you always play the villain. Brandon violently shatters her personal space, stepping so close that the sharp notes of his cologne choke the air from her lungs. Scent is an unforgiving anchor to old trauma, and he weaponizes it flawlessly. He hisses through his teeth, demanding an apology he never earned. Then his dark eyes drop to her stomach, and a wave of pure revulsion washes over his face. He cannot stomach the living evidence that she forged a beautiful life without his permission. For a man addicted to control, watching a former victim flourish is far more agonizing than any physical blow. It shatters the pathetic mythology he built around himself. Never forget this essential truth. The most devastating revenge you can inflict upon those who tried to break you is to simply walk away and be happy. Maddie absorbs the heavy weight of his glare, yet her shoes remain anchored to the marble. She fought too hard to heal her mind to let this phantom drag her back into the dirt. Just as violence threatens to spill, the room's temperature plummets. Stick with me, because you and I are about to witness the contrast between a loud coward and a truly dangerous man. The venomous whispers evaporate. Without a command, every gaze releases Brandon and snaps toward the doorway. It is pure cinematic poetry. Weak men like Brandon must bare their teeth to manufacture respect, but lethal power never raises its voice. Real strength simply steps into the light, and the world instinctively falls silent. That is the quiet peace we must strive to cultivate in our own lives. A low voice rumbles through the heavy air over Maddie's shoulder. That is enough. 3 words delivered with chilling calm instantly shatter the suffocating tension. Before she even turns, the rigid fear melts from her spine. His presence anchors her like a heavy ship in a brutal storm. The irony is beautiful. She looks at Colton Hale, a man with a dark reputation, yet beside him, she feels completely untouchable. Colton does not storm the room, beating his chest like a boy searching for a brawl. He simply glides into the space beside her, shifting his shoulders to forge an invisible, impenetrable fortress against the wolves. True protectors do not incite violence to prove their worth. They offer a quiet, steadfast shelter that stops the chaos dead before it ever touches you. Let us pause the frame here, because this is the exact second the power dynamic flips. Colton stands dangerously at ease, a coiled viper masquerading as a statue. His dark eyes drift to the man threatening her, and the food chain violently resets. Brandon scrambles to maintain composure, but his jaw clamps shut. A flash of genuine terror betrays his eyes before he pastes his fragile mask back on. He puffs his chest, demanding to know who Colton is, but his voice rings pitifully hollow. And Colton? He executes the most devastating maneuver possible. He offers absolute silence. He lets the dead air stretch until Brandon shrinks into a complete joke. Here is a simple lesson for you. Genuine authority never screams for validation. When a darker shadow falls over you, there is nowhere left to hide. The camera pushes in on Savannah, the harsh lighting catching the tremors in her jaw. Her eyes narrow into frantic slits as her fake confidence splinters. It is like watching a tyrant short-circuit when their victim finally fights back. She attempts to puff her chest, snapping that she did not ask for an audience. But Colton, he does not blink. He dismantles her entirely, his voice a dead murmur, flatly stating she has not earned the right to speak. Absolute ice water. In the background, the suffocating shadow over Maddie finally fractures. The invisible leash around her neck snaps, freeing her from paralysis. A beautiful truth emerges here. The exact second you realize the monster under your bed is just a fading memory, it loses all its power to harm you. Moments ago, Maddie was bracing for impact, mentally curling into a ball to absorb whatever cruelty her abuser planned to hurl. But the temperature in the room has violently plummeted. Colton makes no move to be her new master. He merely stands there, an immovable stone wall in the dim light, offering her space to finally catch her breath. It is beautiful how finding one safe soul can unclench a heart trapped in silence. Meanwhile, Brandon is unraveling. The dictator cannot process someone defying his script. He huffs out a breath, accusing Colton of trespassing, but the venom has leaked out of his voice. He watches his twisted empire burn. Remember this well. Those who ruthlessly demand total control are always the ones most terrified of being left with nothing at all. Colton delivers the most chilling line of the sequence here. He does not raise his voice. He simply states, his tone dead and flat, that it is his business because it is her business. That singular sentence swings a wrecking ball into Brandon's fragile ego and violently silences Savannah. It is a profoundly heavy pause for Maddie. The camera lingers on her, suspended between the ghost of the man who shattered her and this unshakable new protector. In that quiet shadow, a spark ignites behind her eyes. The nightmare is no longer dragging her under. It is merely happening around her. The cruelest joke of a toxic bond is the illusion of complete powerlessness. But right here, she realizes she is no longer the prey. The lesson is clear. Your past only dictates your future if you willingly agree to keep playing the victim. You and I have probably both stood in a room when the atmospheric pressure shifts, and it is a tragic beauty to witness. Focus the lens on Savannah. That plastic smile remains, but the muscles around her mouth pull painfully tight. You can practically hear the frantic grinding in her mind as she tries to salvage a game she thought she had won. She operates like a parasite, seeking a fresh nerve to bite. But Brandon is the true spectacle. He physically locks up, his eyes widening in the dim light. This is not mere annoyance flashing across his face. It is the cold terror of realizing a true predator just stepped into his territory. His existence relies on a fabricated crown, a quiet truth to remember. The loudest person in the room is always the one most paralyzed by the fear of being exposed as a fraud. The tragedy of Brandon is that his fragile ego forbids him from retreating, even when outmatched. Watch the subtle shift in his posture. He forces his chest to rise and fall slower, panting behind a mask of calm. He snaps his venomous focus back to Maddie. He remains obsessed with breaking her, convinced she is still his property. Lowering his voice to a gravelly whisper, he employs the classic abuser trick to manufacture danger. He sneers through the shadows, accusing her of fleeing just to find another man to fight her battles. It is a chilling strike meant to rip away her newfound armor and shove her back into the dark corner she escaped. But hear this carefully. Tearing another human being down to make yourself appear taller is the ultimate proof that you are only shrinking on the inside. Now the shadow deepens as the vulture swoops in. Savannah seizes the tension, plastering on a theatrical expression, but the camera catches the poison in her eyes. She sings the accusation of the pregnancy, gesturing toward Colton as if unearthing a sorcery. For Maddie, the words land with the crushing weight of a falling sky. In the twisted world these people inhabit, a woman standing beside a strong man is never viewed as safe. She is perceived merely as an object, traded from one master to the next. It is a brilliantly cruel psychological blade, forged specifically to drag Maddie back into the labyrinth of her self-doubt. Let this be a lesson. Toxic souls will constantly try to convince you that your sanctuary is just another prison, simply because they cannot stand the sight of your freedom. That narrative slices deeper than any physical blow Brandon could deliver. Focus on Maddie's trembling hands. Her knuckles turn ghost white as her fingers dig into her coat. Her nervous system screams danger before her mind processes the strike. But watch the beautiful tragedy of her resilience. She forces her bones to freeze. She draws a ragged breath and silently refuses to let their deranged theater dictate her reality. She spent years breaking her spine to accommodate their madness, and she is finally walking away. Brandon witnesses this quiet rebellion, and his eyes darken into a hollow rage. He snaps violently, demanding her submission as the pressure mounts. A crucial truth to carry with you. The moment you refuse to bend backward, the people who loved walking all over you will completely lose their minds. The interrogation about the child was never a quest for truth. It is a serrated blade designed to publicly bleed her of dignity. It is an ambush, magnified by the voyeuristic gaze of hungry bystanders. Savannah tilts her head, bathed in cruel light, mimicking the sociopathy of a villain who delights in the squirming of victims. She weaves honey into her voice, suggesting the crowd deserves to feast on the tragedy, using the sacred biology of motherhood as a cage. Stick with me, you and I are about to uncover what really went down in this room. The silence turns into a crushing weight, a classic vice meant to crack her armor. But remember this quiet grace. No one is ever entitled to the darkest, most broken chapters of your story, just because they ask with a smile. The agony of this scene lies in Maddie's paralyzed tongue. The stakes of her survival are too severe, and her sacred secret does not belong in the hands of these shattered souls. Before she can plot an escape, Savannah casually detonates the room. Invading Maddie's space, she drops a venomous whisper, accusing her of silence only because she does not know who fathered the child. It is a masterpiece of cruelty. That accusation acts as a lit match tossed into a pool of gasoline. The atmospheric shift is terrifying. Idle curiosity curdles into a nasty, judgmental hum. The wolves are baring their teeth, circling the wounded deer in the stark lighting. The most heartbreaking lesson you will face is that a hungry crowd will always devour a juicy lie rather than sit with a complicated, painful truth. In the theater of a toxic clique, truth is irrelevant. Ruin only requires poison and an audience starving for drama. But watch Colton carefully. His reaction is a cinematic study in lethal restraint. He barely shifts his weight, yet the air thickens, signaling a fatal line has been crossed. He locks onto Savannah with the hollow stare of a shark ascending from the deep. He warns her she is wading into dark waters she cannot fathom. The brilliance is in his delivery. He offers no raised voice, no theatrical threat. He simply narrates the absolute certainty of her destruction. For the very first time, Savannah's painted smile stutters. The camera captures the tremor of panic in her throat. A timeless truth reveals itself here. When a manufactured persona finally collides with a genuine, unyielding threat, the porcelain mask will always crack. Savannah chokes on her panic, gasping that secrets always rise to the surface, clawing desperately for control. Beside her, Brandon's jaw locks. The stunt has pushed his obsessive need for dominance into overdrive. He turns his dark gaze to Maddie, demanding her confession, slipping into that chilling, hypnotic cadence abusers use to pacify victims. It is the exact acoustic poison that built her psychological prison. For one terrifying frame, you see the undertow of past trauma dragging her back into the freezing depths, but then the anchor holds. Colton remains planted at her side, as immovable as a mountain, and the dark spell shatters. He does not scream or draw a sword. He simply holds the line in the shadows. A profound lesson to remember. A true protector does not force you out of the storm. They calmly stand in the rain beside you. Let us look at this final piece together, shall we? We are told that healing means running away, but true salvation is standing in the shadow of the monster who broke you, and feeling absolutely nothing. The camera catches the tremor as Maddie lifts her chin. Her voice, once fragile, slices through the tension like a polished blade. Staring into the void of Brandon's eyes, she tells him she owes him nothing. It is a cinematic masterstroke of boundary setting. Brandon's reality completely short-circuits. His eyes twitch, his fragile ego incapable of processing this resurrected, untouchable version of his favorite victim. Savannah is left burning in the background. And Colton? He remains perfectly silent. Because when you establish a boundary of that magnitude, denying them any further explanation is the ultimate mic drop. Pause the frame right here. Let you and I step into this suffocating room together. The tension compresses, humming like a piano wire pulled taut until it screams. Notice how the stark overhead lights cast deep shadows over Brandon's face as he locks eyes with Maddie. This is no longer fake concern. You are witnessing the naked panic of a control freak, feeling his absolute dominion slip through his trembling fingers. He has never tasted the word no, and her quiet certainty is fracturing his reality. Remember this simple, meaningful life lesson: the loudest anger always erupts from the weakest foundation. For one terrifying heartbeat, you think he might shatter. But watch that micro expression. He is rapidly calculating a dangerous new math in his head. The narrative just flipped on its head. Brandon's gaze disconnects. He is not retreating. He is rapidly recalculating his survival while drowning in a memory that shatters his reality. Beside him, Savannah, the ultimate puppet master, detects his slip instantly. She sees his rigid jaw, his collapsed posture, and her fingers clamp down on his arm like a steel trap. Do not mistake that for a loving touch. It is a physical restraint designed to lock him back into his cage. "What is it?" she asks, her voice bleeding with sudden paranoia. Brandon gives her absolutely nothing, his eyes dead set on Maddie. Always remember this simple, meaningful life lesson: you can never hide your true obsession, no matter who is holding your arm. When his mental gymnastics finally collapse, the crash is brutal to watch. "We came here for a reason," Brandon announces. His voice slices through the suffocating air, a desperate attempt to ground his spiraling mind. Right there, the camera catches Savannah's perfect mask slipping. Just a microscopic blink, but the ultimate manipulator is knocked off her pedestal. "What are you talking about?" she demands, failing to hide her panic. Brandon lets out a ragged breath and drags a trembling hand through his hair. a textbook tale of severe distress. The Heir preparations he blurts out blindly. Here is a simple, meaningful life lesson. Your deepest secrets will always betray you when terror takes the wheel. The raw truth simply spills out before his brain can hit the brakes. The physical reaction in the frame is instantaneous. Savannah's fingers dig into his arm like a vice, her knuckles turning white. She drops the subtle control entirely. This is an aggressive restraint meant to violently snap his attention back to her. The what? She demands. Notice how her voice drops. She abandons the polite, high society persona she was just weaponizing against Maddie. The power dynamic flips upside down. Brandon freezes. It is only a fraction of a second, but that micro-hesitation is a full-blown guilty plea. You said we were browsing, she hisses, her tone vibrating with the terror of losing control. Here is a simple, meaningful life lesson. When a narcissist loses their carefully written script, they become their true, terrifying selves. You can practically hear their toxic alliance snapping right down the middle. Savannah's eyes widen with genuine panic as she watches her perfectly engineered narrative burn to ash. Brandon's gaze darts frantically between his new prize and Maddie. His tough guy armor is melting into pure, primitive desperation. Savannah not here, he mutters, trying weakly to do damage control. But the psychological blast radius is already too large. The suffocating weight of what he just admitted hangs heavily in the silent room. Heir preparations are blood-bound commitments to generational dominance. Take a simple, meaningful life lesson from this tragic moment. Absolute control is a fragile illusion we cling to when we are too terrified to face our own messy reality. In a single cinematic second, the gravity of the room shifts. Nobody is looking at Maddie anymore. Every eye is locked onto the dark motives behind Brandon's meltdown. Beside Maddie, look closely at Colton. He maintains a baseline of chilling calm, shifting his weight with the quiet confidence of an apex predator who knows true dominance means not having to lift a single finger. He watches their relationship fracture in real time. Savannah physically recoils from Brandon. Her hand drops from his sleeve like Skiz is radioactive. You lied to me, she states coldly. All that calculated smoothness is gone, replaced by volatile exposure. Here is a simple, meaningful life lesson. The bitterest part of deceiving others is the inevitable moment you finally deceive yourself. Brandon's jaw locks up so tight you can almost hear his teeth grinding. I did not lie, he snaps back, his voice thick with panic. I just did not explain everything, he tries to rationalize. That is the exact same thing, Savannah fires back. Her icy composure is evaporated, exposing a molten core of pure rage. This is a catastrophic glitch in her matrix. Meanwhile, the camera pans to Maddie, standing perfectly still. The suffocating pressure has lifted off her shoulders, giving her a brief second to breathe. But beneath that relief, a much colder truth hits her. Brandon's slip was a terrifying glimpse into his dark agenda. Here is a simple, meaningful life lesson. An aggressive denial is always the loudest confession of a guilty conscience. The scene vibrates with the exposure of his rotting motives. You only witness this psychological rupture when a manipulator's fabricated reality caves in. In this brutal game, there are no accidents. Suddenly, Colton shatters the tension with a voice that is terrifyingly calm, telling Brandon he has far bigger problems. The irony hangs in the air, thick and brutal. This is the textbook unraveling of a megalomaniac. Brandon buried a toxic secret, and now the earth opens up to swallow him whole. The panic spreads like a virus. Savannah twitches with the erratic energy of someone going down with a burning ship. Her beautiful mask is gone. Here is a simple, meaningful life lesson. The higher the pedestal you build from your lies, the deadlier the fall will be. Savannah shifts her predatory focus off Maddie and locks onto Brandon like a missile. Stick with me, you and I are about to watch this get incredibly interesting. This is the moment the calculating enabler realizes her golden goose is a sinking ship. Brandon is trapped between two collapsing fronts. His authority evaporates while his massive ego tries to keep both women on a leash. Meanwhile, Maddie stands isolated in the center of the blast radius. Her body, carrying the burden of her child, begins to physically absorb this toxic trauma. A deep, agonizing tightening starts low in her abdomen, a brutal warning from her nervous system. Learn this simple, meaningful life lesson. Your body will always keep the score, even when your mind bravely tries to stay strong against the storm. Watch Maddie closely in this shot. She shifts her weight in a survival reflex, pressing her trembling hand against her side. Her breathing turns jagged, broadcasting her agony to anyone who can read human biology. Colton possesses that exact training. He does not need her to utter a syllable. His eyes narrow with the precision of a seasoned operative, tuning out the pathetic soap opera next to them. He orders her to look at him, throwing her a psychological lifeline to pull her out of the dark. She tries to obey, but a brutal wave of pain crashes into her. In the middle of this emergency, Savannah cruelly snaps, demanding to know what is wrong with her. Here is a simple, meaningful life lesson. A truly toxic soul will never be able to see anyone else's pain but their own. The emptiness of Savannah's question is enough to freeze your blood. It is devoid of empathy, dripping instead with irritation. To her warped mind, Maddie's suffering is nothing more than a rude interruption. Brandon finally rips his attention back to the woman he ruined. He steps forward with a tiny flicker of what a fool might call concern, heavily polluted by a twisted sense of possessive entitlement. He asks if she is okay, desperately grasping at the control he is bleeding out. But Colton smoothly slides into the empty space between them, turning his frame into a literal, unmovable brick wall. Here is a simple, meaningful life lesson. Real protection is never about screaming aggression. It is about standing immovable between the innocent victim and the raging storm. Colton tells him she needs breathing room, his tone ringing with terrifying finality. He leaves zero margin for negotiation. You can see Brandon's facial muscles twitching with pure rage. His narcissistic brain rejects the concept of a boundary, but Colton's imposing physical presence forces him to freeze. He barks wildly that he is not talking to Colton, claiming the man has no right to step in. But Colton does not even blink. He stares right through Brandon and softly replies that he already did. Think about the profound tragedy here. While these two men are locked in a silent alpha war, Maddie is fighting to draw a breath, gripping a table so she does not collapse. Take this simple, meaningful life lesson with you. True power never has to scream to prove it is standing in the room. The air in the room turns heavy, pressing down on Maddie as her vision begins to blur. The jagged edge of physical pain crashes into the emotional wreckage she thought she left behind. She planned a clean break from the suffocating gravity of Brandon's control. Instead, he drags her right back into the nightmare. A sharp spasm of agony hits her, tearing a raw gasp from her throat before she can bite it down. It is the breaking point. Colton immediately steps into the frame, reading the fatal tension in the room. His voice drops into a chilling, absolute calm as he declares they are leaving. Let this be a simple, meaningful life lesson. Sometimes, the only way to win a toxic game is to completely walk off the board. You and I must look closely at Colton in this frame. Notice how his hand hovers just an inch from Maddie's arm. It is the hesitation of a man desperate to shield her, terrified of crossing a line. He tells her to sit, but Maddie attempts to play the unbreakable hero, whispering she is fine, even as her frame trembles. The body always betrays the brave face. Brandon steps forward, his ego bruised by another man protecting her. But Colton stops his entire existence with one quiet, lethal sentence. If she is hurt, Brandon is the reason why. Guilt paralyzes him instantly, leaving Savannah completely silent. The harsh reality of life is that a bully only maintains their power until someone holds up a mirror to their own sins. Watch Savannah in the background. A heartbeat ago, she was the queen of the room, but now her gaze is dead. She calculates her next move like a predator realizing her prey has teeth. Maddie forces her trembling legs to stand straight. She battles her own nervous system, fighting off the panic. She is no longer surviving for herself. She is remembering the unborn child inside her. It is a heartbreaking moment, proving a mother will endure any hell to protect her baby. The victim routine evaporates. Colton witnesses this profound shift, transforming into a quiet, immovable anchor at her side. The hard truth of life is that real love is not about fighting someone else's battles. It is about standing perfectly firm, giving them a safe foundation to fight their own. Colton leans in, whispering that she does not have to stay and endure this. His steady voice completely grounds her, pulling her out of a spiraling panic attack. In this fragile instant, Maddie realizes she can simply walk away without it feeling like a defeat. Meanwhile, look at Brandon's rigid posture. He is entirely frozen. He built his whole identity around pulling the emotional strings, and now he is forced to watch his empire crumble in real time. It is a pathetic sight, witnessing his absolute blindness to his own ruin. The air turns dangerously toxic. Listen to me carefully on this one. When the person you have kept crushed under your thumb finally chooses to break the script, your grand empire of lies will always collapse right on top of you. Let us examine this critical frame together. This is no longer petty drama over reputations. The focus shifts entirely to the unborn child, a wild card that brutally detonates the power dynamic of their twisted circle. The tension in the room snaps, yet not a single physical blow is thrown. Instead, the weight of unspoken secrets claws its way to the surface. Brandon's perfectly curated mask finally fractures. He looks at Maddie and realizes she is no longer a hollow puppet he can manipulate. She is a living, breathing force he cannot dominate. This is the fatal wound for his ego. The most agonizing fear for a master manipulator is never about losing a physical fight. It is the suffocating terror of realizing they can no longer write the script for everyone else's lives. The atmosphere shifts, but in a room packed with emotional sharks, it is like a drop of blood in dark water. Savannah catches the scent instantly. Her artificial smile dissolves, leaving the cold eyes of a ruthless interrogator. She demands to know what he is hiding. It is a beautifully brutal confrontation. Brandon exhales heavily, dragging a trembling hand through his hair. He tries to maintain his cool, but you see the panic sweating out of his pores. He mutters an excuse, claiming this is not the time or place, yet his wide eyes betray him. He cannot stop staring at Maddie, consumed by the dark truth he buried. It is a harsh reality of life. You can lie to everyone for years, but the mind will always break down and confess the exact thing it desperately wants to hide. Notice how Colton remains anchored, refusing to speak a single word. It is a stroke of brilliance. By letting the silence drag out, he crafts an agonizing pressure cooker, forcing every ugly secret to boil over. Maddie feels the gravity of the moment. The truths she sacrificed to protect are being dragged into the light, entirely because Brandon's ego is tearing itself apart. Savannah gets dangerously close to Brandon's face, her composure completely shattered. She stares into his soul, accusing him of concealing a massive betrayal. The impact of her words hits him like a physical blow. The biggest takeaway here is this: sometimes absolute silence is far more lethal than shouting. If you simply step back, a guilty person will always interrogate and entirely destroy themselves. The suspense in this room is so incredibly thick it chokes the lungs. Brandon swallows hard, his jaw clenching as his terrified eyes drop to Maddie's stomach. Every ounce of his fake swagger has vanished. He is replaced by a broken man whose entire universe is short-circuiting. He weakly stammers that he did not think this was even possible, and then simply freezes. That fragmented sentence completely hypnotizes the room. Look closely at Maddie's face. She does not flinch. She gazes back with a quiet, tragic understanding. Finally, seeing the broken reality of his mind. You and I know the golden rule here. A lie is just a fragile house of cards. No matter how meticulously a manipulator builds their false reality, the harsh truth is destined to eventually kick down the front door. Watching a man unravel on screen is pure tragedy. Savannah finally snaps. Her patience evaporates as she demands to know what he means, her voice cracking under the weight of paranoia. Brandon slowly blinks, as if silently begging the universe to pull him from this nightmare. But when his eyes open, the untouchable villain is dead. He confesses he cannot have children. The revelation hits the room like a shockwave. Notice the staging of this climax. Nobody screams, nobody shatters a glass. The room plunges into a heavy, suffocating silence that drowns every soul inside it. That is the devastating of true heartbreak. The most destructive truths in life do not arrive with grand fireworks. They show up in absolute silence, burning your deeply held illusions entirely to ash. Savannah stares at him, her posture broken as her relationship dissolves into a cruel joke. She whispers a shattered question, the emotional devastation palpable. Brandon cannot bear to meet her gaze. He locks his desperate eyes onto Maddie, begging his former victim to shield him from his shame. He confesses he knew all along. His infertility was a documented fact. Then, he unleashes a pathetic excuse. He claims he walked away to protect Maddie from discovering it was his fault. It is a sickening display of manipulation, yet you cannot look away. Let this sit with you as a bitter life lesson. A coward will never admit they were terrified. They will always rewrite their cruelest betrayals as tragic, noble sacrifices, just to avoid facing their own pathetic weakness. Stick with me here. We need to unpack the beauty of this moment. Flashes of regret cross Brandon's face, but it is too late to rewrite the script. Maddie lets out a trembling breath, and you can see the heavy chains falling off her soul. For months, he poisoned her mind, making her believe she was the broken one. Hearing him confess the truth is like drawing her first clean breaths in years. Even though the room is a powder keg, an immense psychological weight evaporates from her shoulders. Meanwhile, Savannah stumbles backward, her composure ruined as she realizes she was just another pawn. The lesson shining through this tragedy is clear. When you choose to build a toxic alliance with a snake, you have no right to act shocked when it eventually sinks its fangs into you. Savannah nails him to the wall, exposing how he built his life on a cowardly lie to protect a fragile ego. Brandon flinches as if struck by a physical slap. The camera pans to Colton. He steps into the light, his voice carrying the weight of a judge reading a final sentence. He highlights the cruelest cut of this tragedy. Brandon allowed Maddie to carry the agonizing blame for a burden that was never her. Old Colton strips away every excuse, declaring it a calculated choice. That is the lethal blow. Stripped of his web of lies, Brandon is rendered speechless, reduced to a hollow ghost of the man he pretended to be. The ultimate lesson is simple. Dodging accountability never erases your mistakes. It just ensures the truth will destroy your last shred of respect. The camera pulls back, capturing the devastating quiet of a room suddenly drained of oxygen. You and I are watching a Greek tragedy unfold, frame by agonizing frame. Brandon's fragile armor, built to hide his deepest inadequacies, shatters completely. If he cannot be the father, then the terrifying question hangs in the shadows: who is? Savannah stands frozen in the dim light. Her breath hitches as her mind violently rewrites reality, sifting through every lie she ever told. But watch the framing here. Focus entirely on Savannah's eyes. The crushing heartbreak evaporates, replaced by an absolute freezing darkness. It teaches us a haunting truth about the darker shades of human nature. A shattered heart does not always seek healing. Sometimes, it immediately begins plotting its absolute most ruthless revenge. Let the lens push in slowly. Look closely at the subtle, terrifying shift in Savannah's posture. You can pinpoint the exact frame where a wounded animal transforms into a predator, finding the exposed throat. She locks her gaze onto Maddie, searching the shadows of her face for a single flinch of guilt. Brandon is entirely out of focus now, his stiff body trembling as he shouts his desperate, pathetic questions. But Savannah treats his panic like useless background noise. Her mind is entirely fixated on the catastrophic secret Maddie holds. Her voice drops an octave, freezing the air. "You did not tell him," she murmurs. The mocking tone is gone, leaving only lethal clarity. It proves a bleak but essential truth about this life. Secrets are never merely hidden facts. They are the invisible chains of absolute control, and the one who holds them holds the leash. Notice how the emotional temperature of the scene plummets. Savannah abandons the loud, theatrical insults. Instead, she delivers a surgical, quiet observation, which is infinitely more destructive. The camera catches Maddie's immediate physical betrayal. Look at the trembling of her hands. Her fingers is digging desperately into the fabric of her coat. It is the sheer, suffocating terror of a woman realizing her perfect camouflage is burning away to ash. Beside her, Brandon is mentally collapsing, demanding answers as if he can simply yell loudly enough to force reality back into its original shape. But the director gives him no power here. It is a brutal, agonizing lesson we all eventually face in the dark. The control we believe we have over our lives is nothing but a comforting illusion, right up until someone quietly walks in and shatters the glass. Brandon begs to know what she means, the pathetic rasp in his throat, exposing a man stripped of all dignity. Savannah does not blink. She merely exhales, her voice perfectly hollow. "I am implying," she says softly, "that this child is a highly calculated decision." This is the exact cinematic beat where the genre shifts. It is no longer a tragic drama about infidelity. It is a cold-blooded thriller. The shadows in the room seem to lengthen. Now, shift your focus to Colton. He has not taken a single step, but his broad shoulders lock into place like a guard dog sensing blood in the water. His stillness is absolutely terrifying. It teaches us a very painful truth. Genuine danger never screams for your attention. It simply slips into the room unnoticed, smiles warmly at you, and locks the heavy door behind you. Watch closely, because this is where the dynamic fractures. Colton tracks every micro-expression, and suddenly his dark eyes lock onto Savannah. "Be careful," he murmurs. The delivery is flat, but beneath it lies a promise of absolute violence. Savannah meets his gaze with the chilling smile of a detective finding the murder weapon. "I understand far more than you realize." She counters, dissecting Maddie under the harsh light. "You were always so quiet," she breathes out, weaponizing those forgotten years. It forces a complete mental rewind of every frame they shared. Because the hardest lesson is that the quietest souls are rarely just shy. They are silently gathering the exact ammunition required to destroy you. The script leaves no room for mercy as Savannah goes straight for the fatal wound. She points out how the world cast Maddie as the compliant victim, completely blind to the fact that Maddie was running her own dark surveillance. Watch the rise and fall of Maddie S. chest slow down. It is the instinctual brace for a catastrophic impact. In stark contrast, Brandon S. face contorts into the ugly mask of a confused child. His monumental arrogance kept him completely in the dark. "What are you talking about?" he pleads, his tyrant persona crumbling into dust. Savannah refuses to even grant him eye contact. "She knew you could never give her a child," she states, dropping the final weight onto the scene. It highlights the bitter poetry of human existence. The absolute loudest, most towering egos always shatter the hardest when the truth finally arrives. The fallout from that single line is utterly atomic. The camera pans sharply to Brandon, his eyes wide, silently begging the woman he supposedly loved to deny this nightmare. But Maddie does not blink. She simply stares back, deploying a heavy, weaponized silence that confirms every single one of his deepest insecurities. It is agonizing to watch Savannah slowly twist the knife. "If she knew about your condition," Savannah delivers with measured, theatrical cruelty. "Then she knew exactly how badly this would break you. This was never an accident. It was a flawlessly calculated sniper shot to his soul." It forces us to accept a chilling reality. The deepest, most fatal wounds never come from the enemies rushing at us with drawn swords. They are inflicted by the quiet people sitting beside us, taking detailed notes on exactly where our armor is cracked. A hollow no scrapes its way out of Brandon S.'s throat. The audio mix would isolate that sound, the literal frequency of a man S. spirit collapsing inward. He cannot process the image of his obedient wife executing such a flawless betrayal. His reality is bleeding out on the floor, and standing just inches away, Colton remains chillingly still. There is no defensive flinch, no panicked shifting of weight. Notice the terrifying brilliance of this cinematic framing. When a bomb goes off, absolute stillness is the most damning confession of all. Colton S. dead silence is a blinding spotlight of guilt, and Savannah S. sharp eyes catch it immediately. It brings a profound truth into sharp focus. The most lethal weapons in our lives are never the elaborate lies we invent to protect ourselves. They are the vital, destructive details we deliberately hold back. Unless Savannah draws out the word, letting the suspense choke the room, this was never a solo job. The heartbeat of the scene completely flatlines. The rules of engagement just violently shifted. This is no longer merely a domestic scandal. It is a frantic hunt to expose the apex predator who stood in the shadows. The silence is incredibly heavy, like the agonizing pause right before a massive structure caves in. But watch the profound shift in Maddie's posture. While the men spiral into panic, a beautiful, tragic clarity washes over her tear-stained face. All those years of walking on broken glass are over. She is exposed, yet deeply peaceful. It reveals a profoundly beautiful truth. True liberation does not happen the moment you finally walk out the door. It happens the exact second you completely stop being afraid of the consequences of your own survival. This ugly truth has been circling them in the dark for months, camouflaged by deceit. But as the director knows, denial always carries a strict expiration date. Slowly, Savannah turns her head and locks her gaze dead onto Colton. The framing here is as precise and devastating as a sniper exhaling before the final shot. She has found her mastermind. "It is you," she whispers, devoid of theatrical drama. It is just the terrifying satisfaction of the steel trap snapping shut. Brandon violently whips around, his face a hideous mask of pure rejection. "That is statistically impossible," he stammers, desperately weaponizing logic against a reality that is already tearing his soul apart. It exposes a deeply tragic human flaw. We will gladly cling to the most ridiculous crumbling delusions just to avoid facing the agonizing pain of ultimate betrayal. Brandon's frantic protests echo off the walls, sounding utterly hollow. Deep within his own arrogant mind, the jagged puzzle pieces are already snapping together. Now, focus the lens entirely on Colton. He refuses to participate in the hysterical, desperate theater that Brandon heavily relies on. Instead, Colton radiates a chilling, immovable calmness that makes the chaos around him feel entirely insane. For a fraction of a second, his eyes dart to Maddie. It is a silent, unbreakable tether, an absolute vow that he will stand by her even as the entire world burns to ash. Stick with me, because this teaches a vital lesson about dominance. The most powerful person in any room is rarely the one screaming for attention. It is the one who completely refuses to react. The Savannah slowly exhales, her dark eyes glittering as she mentally adapts to this deadly shift in power. A freezing wave of realization washes over Savannah's face, pulling the final thread of the mystery tight. "Of course," she murmurs, a dark, humorless smile touching her lips. Colton's terrifyingly calm posture finally makes total cinematic sense. "That is why you never panicked," she whispers, stepping into his space. "You already knew." Upon hearing those words, Brandon literally stumbles backward, as if the script just delivered a physical blow to his chest. The very foundation of his identity is turning to ash right in front of the camera. "You are trying to tell me," he chokes out, his throat constricting around the toxic truth. His fragile psychology is completely shutting down to protect his pride. And here we find the ultimate, devastating conclusion to this scene. Absolute hardest pill to swallow in this life is always the one that permanently destroys our carefully crafted ego. The camera pushes in on Maddie as the room's tower dynamic shatters. She had braced for a terrible explosion, expecting her toxic chains to snap with violent force. Instead, the air grows heavy, settling around her like solid iron. Notice the subtle shift in her shoulders as her panicked heartbeat finally stops. The harsh lighting catches the deliberate lift of her chin. She is nobody's victim now. "He did not find this out today," she says, staring dead into Brandon's hollow eyes. "He has known." Those words vaporize Brandon's fake charm, leaving only a terrified man realizing he was never in control. "You knew," he whispers, his voice stripped of its old power. It reveals a simple, profound truth. Tyrants shrink to absolutely nothing the second they realize nobody is afraid of them anymore. Let us freeze the frame right here, because you and I both knew this devastation was coming. The shadows deepen around Colton. Not a single muscle twitches on his face as he drops the heaviest truth on their chests. Look closely at Savannah. She takes a sharp breath, her cold eyes darting across the room like a predator calculating a kill. She looks at Maddie, and the tragic realization hits her. This is not just about a child. This is a territorial flag violently driven into the earth. In their twisted world, blood is the only currency, and Colton just bought the board. It leaves us with a bitter lesson we must all learn. The people who remain the quietest about their power are always the ones most prepared to burn the world down to protect what is theirs. Pause the scene again, because Colton refuses to let Savannah rewrite this tragic narrative. He corrects her, his voice a terrifying calm that sends ice down your spine. This is no cheap power play. This is his future. Watch the emotion in his eyes. The lighting catches a fleeting glance toward Maddie, exposing a lifetime of agonizing love. Then the warmth vanishes, replaced by a stare as cold as an open grave. He drops the final hammer. They are locked out forever. Look at Brandon, completely paralyzed. His years of toxic torture have been reduced to ash. Savannah understands the shift, though. There is a deeply humbling truth here for us all. Sometimes the absolute smartest thing a person can do is accept they are outmatched, swallow their pride, and walk away from the ruin. You and I must watch this final sequence together. It is the cinematic payoff we have been waiting for. Watch the tension leave Maddie's body. She lets out a shaking exhale, dropping years of terror onto the floor. The trauma does not vanish, of course. Human tragedy never resolves like a fairy tale, but let the camera linger on her face. The lighting is softer now. She is no longer a terrified prisoner. As Colton guides her through the smoldering ruins of her past, you witness something profoundly beautiful. She drops her victimhood like a tattered coat. It leaves us with one enduring lesson. A cruel world might shatter your spirit into pieces, but when you finally forge yourself back together, that new armor is completely unbreakable. She is no longer a tragedy. She is a survivor.